Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean and returning special guest Chris. And we're actually filming at Chris's house in Half Moon Bay, California. What we're going to show you is a fix for the main steering shaft. The reason for the fix is you have some type of abnormal play in your steering and you've done some other diagnosing to eliminate things. You've checked your steering rack bushings. You've already tried replacing the steering guide. You've looked into swapping your outer and inner tie rods, but you still have some type of play in your steering and you can't for the life of you figure out where it's coming from. Well, somebody on one of the Toyota forums came up with a fix for play in the steering that he found, and what it is on the main steering shaft. The steering shaft has a collapsible feature that's a protective mechanism in case you get into an accident. It's meant to collapse and basically telescope together so the steering wheel and column doesn't go into the driver's chest. So over time, that joint can develop a little bit of excessive play, and then it makes your steering feel a little bit sloppy and your steering kind of wanders on you, especially at faster speeds, at highway speeds. So there's two fixes that people do. They take the shaft out and they either put a little tack weld on opposing sides to lock the two shafts together, or they drill a hole through both shafts and they put a rolled steel pin. We're going to do the tack weld method because we like that one better, and Chris has a Hobart welder and he knows how to weld. So he's going to tack weld it rather than drill and use a rolled steel pin. Another thing that we're going to do while we have that shaft out is the tilt steering wheel ball has two plastic halves to it. And what a guy on a Toyota forum again figured out is if he put a thin piece of plastic between the two halves of that plastic tilt wheel ball, it makes the joint a little bit tighter and takes some slop out of the steering. So we're going to show you how to do that too. An important disclaimer is if you do this, you are possibly defeating the safety feature that's built into that steering shaft. If you do get in an accident, maybe the tack welds hold so firmly that the two shafts don't telescope into each other, or that rolled steel pin you put in there does the same thing. It doesn't allow the two shafts to collapse on each other. So do this at your own risk. This is for people that are just tired of the slop in their steering and they understand the consequences of doing this modification, and so do it at your own risk. Chris and I learned about this modification to the steering shaft through the Toyota forum TTORA. It's Toyota Territory Off-Road Association. A guy did a nice write-up of how we pulled the shaft out, and then it got a ton of comments, and then somebody came up with a much easier way to get the steering shaft out, and that's the way we're going to show you. We're going to put a link in the video description to that forum so you can read through that thread and learn everything that we learned before doing this job. For this job, there's really no parts really necessary other than if you're going to go the rolled steel pin route, you have to have one of those, but this just takes pretty much basic tools. And if you go for the welding route, well, you can pull the shaft out, you could bring it to a guy that knows how to weld, or you could just find a local like muffler shop and just tell them, hey, I want a couple tack welds on this, and they'll probably charge you like 10 bucks, 20 bucks to do it for you. With all that said, let's get started on this job. All right, so we're going to disconnect the negative battery terminal off the post because we don't want any power to the vehicle. The reason why is we are going to be messing with the steering wheel, which has an airbag on it, and we want to take away any risk of the airbag going off and ruining our day because the airbags explode at a speed of 200 miles per hour, and if you are in the path of that airbag, it can really hurt you. All right, we're inside the vehicle. Chris has his hand on the main shaft assembly and he has his other hand on the steering wheel, and he's going to show you how you can check to see if you do have play in this shaft. So he's basically turning the wheel with his right hand, his left hand is on the main shaft, and he's feeling for a little bit of slop in that steering shaft.
You can kind of feel it clunking when you turn it back and forth with your left hand that is on the steering shaft.
The first things we're going to take off are the upper and lower column covers. Chris is using a Phillips screwdriver, and the first screw he's going to go for is on the underside. He's going to turn the ignition key to the on position so he can unlock the steering wheel so he can turn it to where he can get the next screws out. The screw is a little bit hard to get out with your fingers, so Chris is going to use a magnet to get the screw out. So now what Chris did is he just turned the steering wheel to the right to expose the screw next to the windshield wiper switch, and now he's going to get this screw out. Now that we have those 3 screws removed, Chris is going to separate the upper and lower halves of the column cover. So Chris, being the smart guy that he is, copied old Timmy the Toolman, and he bought the same interior trim removal set that I bought, and he's going to utilize one of these skinny blade tools to get in between the 2 halves and help him separate them. So Chris was able to get the blade of the tool in between the 2 halves, and now he's going to try to pry them apart. And there, he's got the passenger side of the covers apart. Now he's got to work on the other side. So you saw what he just did there. He used the tilt wheel. He tilted the wheel up to where he can get the lower half out. Now he tilted it back down. Now he's going to work on getting the upper half out. Okay, we have the upper and lower column covers out of our way. The next thing we're going to work on is getting these 2 tension springs released. So to get the spring out, we tried a couple different things and we found the best way to get this out. We got a medium-sized pair of vice grips clamped onto the spring close to the coils, and then now the next thing you want to do is take a little tension off this by putting the tilt wheel all the way up. Now that there's less tension on the spring, you'll have an easier time pulling the spring towards the steering wheel to unhook it. And that's all you have to do. Now we're going for the spring on the driver's side of the steering column, so we're going to tilt the wheel up. Chris was finding that getting the spring unhooked, he was hitting the back side of the blinker switch, so he's going to just take a couple screws out so we can just remove this blinker stock out of the way to where we can get the spring out easier. It's just a couple screws and an electrical connection. Now that we got the screws out, we got to disconnect this electrical connection. So it's like got a push tab here, push it down and pull back on the electrical connection. Okay, now that's out of our way. We should be able to pull this right out, like so. Now look at all the room that he has to pull this spring backwards to clear it of the hook. There he goes. Chris finally summoned his man strength and got it out. We took the spring all the way out. We just want to show you where it actually hooks in back behind the column. Just pay attention when you pull the spring out where the other side connects to. It's those little holes right there. Chris is back underneath the dash, and the next step we're going to do is we're going to mark the shaft. We're making match marks, so when we pull the shaft out, we know we're going to be able to get it back in the same exact spot. So you might be wondering, what is this crazy thing we got going on? Well, we just want to make sure before we pull the shaft out that this thing isn't going to start turning on us. So we just took some painter's tape and taped it to the column, and hopefully it's going to stay put and not start spinning on us when we take it out. The first thing we're going to do is loosen this 12mm set nut on the steering shaft so we can pull the steering shaft out. Next, we're going to work on getting these two 6mm bolts on the driver's side and passenger side of the steering column out. As you can see, he's using a standard Allen wrench. It would be nice if we can get a socket in there, but there's not room to get a socket and ratchet in there. We have the driver's side 6mm bolt out. Now we're working on the passenger side. And what we know is that as soon as we get that bolt free, the whole column's going to want to drop. So Chris is going to use one hand to get the bolt out while supporting the steering wheel with his other hand. We notice that we have to get a bunch of electrical connections disconnected now. Chris is going to first disconnect the one for the airbag, and it's got a special little clip that he has to get out of the way first before he can pull the electrical connection out. So he's going to squeeze those tabs together and then pull outward, and then now he has easier access to get that switch out. So that's number one. Now we got to get one off on the passenger side. That one's out, and he's going to get this other black one that's next to the airbag. That one's out. The final thing that we have to get disconnected is these two little clips that hold the whole wiring harness to the steering column. So he's got to just compress those clips and get them out of that little bracket. Okay, now that's disconnected. Now we should be able to pull this whole steering shaft right out. Oh. And Chris ain't messing around. He pulled that out with authority. Now here's the reason why we taped this, and we might have to improve on our tape job, but now that everything's disconnected, you can see how this can freely spin on you. If you find that your tape got displaced like it did for us, tape it up a little better so it keeps everything in the same orientation. It can mess up your clock spring if it makes too many rotations. Right now the clock spring is in its neutral position where you can turn it 2.5 times to the left and 2.5 times to the right. So here's the main shaft assembly. The joint that develops play is this joint right here, where this shaft can slide into this shaft. The reason for this is it's a protective mechanism in case you get in an accident. It's meant to collapse so the steering column and steering wheel doesn't drive into your chest. So these two pieces are supposed to collapse together, and this joint will get a lot of play. Now, we were suspecting that we were going to have a lot of play in this joint, but this joint is tighter than a gnat's ass. There's no play whatsoever. So whatever play that Chris was experiencing isn't from here, but we're still going to explain how you go about fixing abnormal play here, and Chris is going to go ahead and put a couple tack welds here. So there's two ways to fix this. Number one, you put a little tack weld on one side and then on the opposing side. And then another way that guys do it is they drill a hole through both these shafts, and then they take a rolled steel pin and they insert a rolled steel pin in here, and then that takes the play out. So that's everything about fixing the play in this shaft. There is another thing that people have done to reduce play in their steering. You have this tilt ball, or you can call it a dumaflachi or a chingadera. People on the forums call this a tilt ball, and it's got two halves to it. And what guys have done is they take a skinny piece of plastic that they cut out the shape of it, and they put it in between the two halves of the ball to take up a little more space to make this joint feel a little bit tighter. We're not only going to do the tack weld on the shaft, but we're going to do the addition of a little bit of a plastic shim between these two tilt ball halves. Now Chris is going to show you how we can easily disconnect this whole shaft with this ball and get it disconnected right here. It's pretty simple. So all Chris has to do is turn the column 90 degrees either direction, right or left, and then he can easily rotate the shaft out now. Pretty simple. Chris is going to show the play that we're going to try to eliminate by putting a shim in between these two halves. So you can see it moving. So in order to get the two halves of the tilt wheel ball out, Chris is going to spin the two halves of this tilt wheel ball 90 degrees to where he can pop it out. Just like so. He's going to put one of the halves on a piece of plastic. We're going to use a oil bottle, and he's going to trace it out, cut it out, and that is going to become his shim. The thickness of the plastic for a standard oil bottle is 0.025 inches. All right, so we're ready to put a couple tack welds on this steering shaft. I'm not the welder, Chris is the welder. Chris is going to explain the settings he's using on his Hobart welder to get this job done.
So I set it to 5 for the power and 40 to the wire feed speed. That's what the guide in the manual says for the Hobart instructions, and we looked at the gauge that my welder also came with, and we compared it with the steering shaft, and we came up with 1/8 of an inch thickness for the metal.
Now, not everybody is going to have a welder. Not everybody's going to know how to weld. Where could you get this done? Well, there's muffler shops all over the city. A muffler shop might be a place where you could just bring it to them and say, hey, I want a tack weld, one on one side, one on the other side. Or maybe you know somebody that fabricates, somebody local to you, and they could do it for you. You just got to find someone that knows how to weld and knows what they're doing. All right, here we go. Weld away. So here's the two tack welds on opposing sides. You can see it's just really minimalistic. All it's doing is keeping the shafts from having that excessive play. It's not really for strength per se, just to keep the two halves from rattling in each other. That's all it's doing. So what we got going on here is we have a half of the tilt wheel ball. We're going to place it on top of the oil container, and we're going to trace it out, and then we're going to use a utility blade and cut it out.
We just cut this out, lined it up, traced it out, and we cut a hole in the middle for the spring, and hopefully it'll be a good spacer.
With the spacer in place between the two halves, you're able to get it back in, but because you've just made this whole assembly a little bit wider, you're going to fight it a little bit. But if you just really compress the two halves together and with some strength, you can rotate it back into position. Just know that you're going to fight it a little bit to get it back in position. Now we're going to get some molybdenum lithium-based grease all along this joint. At the end of the main shaft assembly, there's a notch right here. We noted that this was actually facing up, and the area where Chris put the mark was facing down towards the floorboard where your feet go. This is the correct orientation for us, so we know the direction needs to go back into the steering column. So just like we got this shaft out, he turned the column upper tube 90 degrees to one side. He slid it in, and then now he's got to rotate it into position. Just like so. And what we're noticing now, this joint is feeling a lot tighter now. So the little shim that we put in between the two halves has just made this connection much tighter. So now we just gotta put this thing back into the vehicle. Okay, we are ready for the reinsertion of the steering shaft and steering wheel.
You have to pull this little metal thing down the tilt mechanism uses to really be able to get it to slide all the way back on.
The first thing that we're getting in, now that we got the steering shaft all the way in, is the two 6mm bolts that go on either side of the column. The torque spec for these tilt wheel bolts is 12 foot-pounds. What we're going to do is we're just going to get them nice and tight with the Allen wrench and call it good.
The steering coupling in the firewall slipped down a little bit off of the steering assembly, so I'm just going to try to slide it back up into place. There it is. We're going to put this bolt back into the steering assembly. The torque spec is 26 foot-pounds, but we're just going to get it good and tight.
That's a German spec, right?
Yeah.
Good and tight.
Now we're just removing the tape from the steering wheel.
Now we're going to work on getting all these electrical connections back connected. What Toyota does for you is they don't make any two connectors that are near each other the same size, so there's no way you can mix these things up. So you just push that wiring harness back into the bracket with the two clips. That's the power to the windshield washer stock. That was for the airbag. And what is that one for?
Some kind of steering wheel, maybe the horn.
Something. It's for something. We're plugging it back in. Chris is now reinstalling the light and turn signal stock.
Now we're just putting the electrical connection back into the turn signal stock.
So again, we're using the vice grips to get it back into position. You grab it in the same spot, you pull it towards the steering wheel, and you get it hooked. So you see the bigger of the two holes, I slide the spring into that bottom one, and then I hook it into the spring through the other hole. There it is. Now that we got both of the springs in place, now we're going to get the upper and lower column covers back in place.
So you actually want the top cover to be kind of in place first, and that way you can slide the bottom cover up a lot easier.
That looks like it.
That's it.
Chris has both the upper and lower column cover pieces snapped together. Now he's just going to get the 3 screws back in position. Chris has both of the upper screws in, and now he's just going to get the one on the bottom in. All right, it's completely back together.
Oh, it is better.
It's better?
Uh-huh.
So Chris is doing the same shake of the steering wheel, holding the shaft below, and he has figured out that it is feeling better.
Don't forget to reconnect your battery after you're done.
All right, we are done with this job. We showed you 2 fixes you can do related to your steering shaft. The first one was putting a tack weld on the collapsing parts of the main shaft assembly to make sure that there's not excessive play that's causing your steering to have excessive play or it to wander when you're on the road. And then we showed you that little fix that you could put a skinny plastic sleeve in between the two halves of that tilt wheel ball to tighten up that joint to make your steering feel tighter and more responsive. Even though that it appeared that we didn't have to do a tack weld for the main shaft, but decided to do it anyways because we already had the shaft out, may as well do it. We took it for a test drive and Chris said that the steering felt better, so it was worthwhile for us to do the job. With all that said, we thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean, and special returning guest Chris. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. Take care. Bye-bye. Sick mouth.